Hey, what's up YouTube? Mike here. Today we're going to learn how to write unit tests in Swift. So yeah, we're going to be using Xcode. We're going to write our own unit tests for an app. I have the starter app right here, but first let's go over the steps to making unit tests. So we're going to create a new unit test target, and the little sidebar has an option for this. Import the project as testable, initialize the class and setup, release the system under test in tearDown, and then set up the test function and add a test failure breakpoint. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So here is the starter project. You can download it in the link below. Make sure you get the starter branch. The final branch is the one with the answer in it. So yeah, start with the starter branch here, and let's go ahead and add our unit test. So we're going to go up here. This is the test inspector, and we're going to hit the plus button here. Say new unit test target, and we're going to say swipe recognizer tests. And in here we have the test example and test performance example that are just like the boilerplate code that comes with a test. So here you can measure how much time it takes to do certain tests. And speaking of time, let's go into the little slideshow I made here, and not that one. Let's go into the first principles of testing. The first one being fast, which reminded me of this. And so tests should be fast and efficient. What does that mean? It means that for unit testing, or test-driven development, as people say, which is basically just saying you want to write the tests before you write the functions, or at least like at the same time. So when you want it to be fast, they should be like broken down into smaller bits. So for this, we're going to see like when the swipe up function is performed, if it increases our up count by 1. That's all we're doing. So yeah, they should be broken down into little pieces like that, and it helps to have your code broken down into pieces and using like a MVC or MVVM type framework, or you know what I mean, whatever layout, whatever you want to use for that. In your app, so that you can break it down like that. And independent, so tests shouldn't share states. So each test should have its own instance of the object that you're testing, basically. And we'll see. We're going to do that in setup and breakdown. You want it to be repeatable, of course. You get the same results every time you test. So testing network requests or something like that would require some mock data that you would feed into the test, so that you know you're going to get the same data every time you run the test. Self-validating, so it should return pass or fail every time. You can run a test where you print the outcome of something, but you want it to pass or fail, and that's why in here they have the check marks. If you saw, if you run the tests, the blank tests, they'll run all check marks, or if they fail, you'll get an X. So you want them to either, pass or fail every time. Timely, you want it to write it at the same time or before you write the performing code, which is the hint for test-driven development. That's basically what test-driven development is. And you don't need to write it for everything, or write unit tests for everything. I have this slide here, and this is my opinion. That's why I put up their opinion. And this slide, these slides are in my Google Docs, so I put the link down there. You guys can take a look at this, and I think you can download it. Hopefully you can. But yeah, should you unit test everything? And I don't think so. Some places you work might want you to unit test everything you add, and that's not the worst way to do things. It's a good check against failure, but they can make your code harder to read and navigate, and that is because if you break everything into these tiny little bits, then especially if you're working with other people, they're going to find it hard to navigate the app. It's going to be harder for them to read. So stick to unit testing things that are important, like your core functionality, the things that are necessary for your app to work, like especially any like arithmetic you have in the app. Network calls. Network calls are good to test. I have a video on that as well that I'm working on. The link will be in here. But anyway, any like hard to replicate features, so that's basically called boundary testing. So what you do is, like, you see what would happen to the UI if you put in a label that was like 1,000 characters long, and you make sure that the UI is holding still at the height, width. It's not clipping, the label's not clipping and stuff like that. Or, if you have a game and you get to level 30 and so you get some kind of cool animation or cutscene or something like that, you probably want to test that instead of going through your app and, playing it all the way to level 30 just to test it. That encompasses hard to replicate. Bug fixes. If you're writing your tests or writing your code in MVC or MVVM, Viper, whatever you use, good tests will be able to isolate where the bugs are. You can also use breakpoints and stuff like that. So there's a lot of ways to solve these problems. There's a million ways to test, just like there's a million ways to code. So don't be stressed out that you don't know everything about unit testing. The same way, like, you can learn about the URL session library and then about it. With testing, you can learn about the XC asserts and things like that. But you'll never know everything about testing because it changes with your app. You're testing things in your app. So, don't worry too much about knowing everything about testing, or, it seems like a daunting, a whole different thing. It's not. It's very simple, and what we're about to do is something that you're going to see how simple it is. And it can be used for a lot of different useful things. So, in here, we have the setup and the teardown. As well as an example and performance example. We're not going to be using those, so let's just delete those. And in the setup and teardown, we want to go ahead and call the super class. So I want to say super.setup, and that'll happen at the beginning, so our code's going to go here. And then in the teardown, we want it to happen at the end. So we want to say super.teardown. We're going to put our code before that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import testable. So I'll start with testable import swipe recognizer, which is our app here. And so this will import a testable copy of swipe recognizer, which is great. Apple does a lot of the work for you. In order to set up a instance of this class, or instance of the class we want to test, which is the view controller, we're going to say our system under test, which is referred to as a SUT, S-U-T. If you see that around, that's all it is. It's just whatever object you're testing. That's all that refers to. So we're going to create a reference to view controller here. And then we're going to say system under test equals view controller, which is our view controller, whatever you want to call yours. And so that's the second step. And then, to make sure to do, well, it's actually the third step. But the fourth step here is to set up the teardown function. And you always want to do this, or just me personally, I want to set this stuff up. You want to drop the system under test, so make it nil, and then do the super teardown. So this is good to do when you're setting it up initially, so you don't, you think the natural order of things would be to set up the test, do the test, and then tear it down. But just, if you change things in setup, make sure to deallocate them in teardown whenever you do that. So, all right. So the next thing, we're going to actually write our test. So what we want to test here is, as you can see, this app right here. Let's just look at the storyboard so you can see kind of where I'm going with this. This box, when you swipe up, down, left, or right, there's 4 gesture recognizers attached to this. And when you swipe up, the label, you add 1 to the count and the label goes up, and left. Oh, and here what we're trying to do is we're going to make sure that when we call this up swipe function, that up count is increased by 1. Here, let's go ahead and make a function. And the way to name things is usually func and then test and then what you're going to test. So we're going to test up swipe calculation. So just the math, just that up count goes up. And we're going to use the format that a lot of testing is done in all different kinds of languages, and that is the given, then, when. So given, when, then. That's kind of a tongue twister. Give me a break. But yeah, so given, you want to set up the properties you're going to test, and then when is where you actually perform the test, and then is where you're going to check the test. So whenever I do it, especially if you're starting out, I like to set up given, and then to when, and then 3 then. So we want to just see if it goes up by 1, so let's make sure it's 0. So let's say system under test dot up count is going to equal 0 right here. And what happens? So what's happening here is we're going into here, and up swipe is going to do what we need. So we're going to perform the up swipe by ourselves. So I'm going to say system under test dot up swipe, and then for sender we can just say self, as in like the testing view controller. And then under the then, we're going to use a new thing called XCT assert equal, and you're basically taking these, like it'll take 2 things and make sure they're equal. So when you import the testable, when you make something testable, it makes functions, properties, variables, things like that equatable. So you can put, it's almost like saying any in these boxes. So we're going to say the system under test dot up count, and that should be equal to 1 if we've done this function properly, right? And then the message, if it fails, is going to be up swipe calc test failed. And then in order to run it, we can run all the things by hitting the play button up top here, or we can just run each individual one by hitting this one, which, since it's the only test inside of it, doesn't matter. I had to go back and make sure that I was on the iPhone 11 simulator, because I always use like a less processor kind of phone to test on. So yeah, and so in here it's going to throw an error that says we found nil by implicitly wrapping an optional value. So in the test, the problem with the test here is that there's no mention of the label, and in our view controller we have it's a forced cast as a label. So it's expecting there to be some kind of value here. So the test has actually uncovered something that's unsafe in our app, which is pretty neat. And when is a UI label ever going to not exist? I know, but it's better safe than sorry. So here, instead of an exclamation point, we can put a question mark, and we're going to optional chain the uplabel.text. And now we're going to stop this, and let's go back and run it. And this will also just run the one individual test. But again, since it's the only one, like, oh, I think we missed a spot. Yep. Okay. Now let's go back in here and run this test. And that's a great feeling to get those green check marks. So we're on the right track here. Our next step is going to be to add a test failure breakpoint. And that is here in the breakpoint thing, breakpoint inspector, whatever they call it. So we're going to add test failure breakpoint, and it does all of the, we don't have to put the specific breakpoint in here. We just have to add a test failure breakpoint and then make the test fail. So let's say the up count, we're going to make it, we're expecting a 2 here or something like that, which isn't going to be correct, right? So yeah, let's run this and see what happens. And anytime now. Testing. I think I'm breaking the fast rule here. I think it's actually my computer is breaking the fast rule, but okay. Boom. And so there we have the thread 1 test failure. And it's a pretty useful thing to have, to add the test failure breakpoint. And again, that test failure breakpoint automatically will break at any test that fails. So, I'm a big fan of using things that make your app fail, like, things like throw in a fatal error when something doesn't, like a if let is nil or something in the else clause, throw a fatal error just so you can, see if that happens, right? A lot of times your app crashing on you is the best thing to ever happen to you if you're hunting down a bug. So yeah, so now we've added breakpoints. See if you can just type up yourself the down swipe calculation, left swipe calculation, right swipe, just to kind of get a hang for it. And when you type things in, at least for me, like, I feel like I learn it a lot better if I just type things manually, even if it just kind of feels like busy work, So maybe you want to test things in your own app as well, and that's great. But yeah, adding simple things to this app might give you a little more confidence with testing. So I know it does for me. So yeah, that was basically all I had to show you for unit testing. If you want to know what to do next, as far as unit testing is concerned, I have some videos I'm working on network calls and testing network calls, by the way. Testing gesture recognizers. I'm going to be using the same swipe recognizer thing. So I'll put those on the end screen here when I get done with those. At the same time, if you want things that aren't me related, check out swiftbysendel.com. He is big on like unit testing in Swift. He's got a lot of good articles, like from introduction articles to more complex testing. So yeah, check out swiftbysendel.com. And yeah, happy testing.